Dear friends, the global scientific community is increasingly discussing the possibility of including a new diagnosis in the official list of mental disorders. This is a severe obsessive condition in which the patient is simultaneously convinced that Russia is on the verge of complete collapse, but at the same time is about to enslave the whole world. Russian experts, in turn, suggest supplementing this diagnosis with another characteristic feature, the irrational belief that one can harm Russia with impunity without fear of any consequences. This issue is definitely worth your attention. Friends, let's not delay, we're starting. In 2022, the European authorities decided to play a dangerous game that resembles Russian roulette and announced the freezing of Russian financial assets. It was about a huge amount of money, which at that time was mainly in the international financial depository Clearstream. It would seem that the scheme was thought out perfectly. Without a single shot, without tanks and planes, Europe managed to damage Russia. Moreover, the West was confident that not a single one of its servicemen would suffer in this process. Everything was civilized, European style. Simple logic. It was yours, it became ours. What will you do to us? Will you bomb our servers, banks, and offices? However, Russia was in no hurry to take retaliatory measures, observing the development of events. Meanwhile, the European elites, as if forgetting about the possible consequences, began to redistribute these frozen funds, directing tens of billions of dollars to direct financial assistance to Ukraine. At the same time, loans allocated to Kiev were provided with income from Russian assets. It seemed to the West that this was an impeccable scheme, but Moscow immediately made it clear that such steps would not be without consequences. It was stated that Russia would take mirror and asymmetric measures, and the consequences for Europe would be very painful. The situation began to develop rapidly. After Trump came to power, who raised the issue of ending military support to a well-known country in Europe and began to gradually reduce funding, panic began in the European Union. Ursula von der Leyen has announced a massive €800 billion plan for the militarization of Europe. This money was planned to be used both for the rearmament of EU countries and for the continuation of military assistance to Ukraine. The European Union has decided to demonstrate that it is able to cope with the crisis on its own and no longer needs American dollars. Against this background, other players have also strengthened. For example, the Dutch government has announced the allocation of €3.5 billion to continue supporting the famous country next year. In turn, the German Chancellor promised trillions of euros for Europe's military needs. However, at the same time, the EU continued to experience serious economic difficulties. Sanctions against Russia led to a sharp increase in energy prices for Europe, the industrial recession intensified, and the United States, under pressure from Trump, demanded that NATO countries increase their contributions to the alliance. Against the background of all these problems, a new idea began to take shape in Europe. Increasingly, there have been calls not just to use interest on frozen Russian assets, but to completely withdraw them. At the end of February, the Estonian foreign minister said that the decision to send income from Russian assets to help Ukraine was a step in the right direction. He was followed by Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, which also expressed their willingness to consider the possibility of a complete seizure of Russian funds. But the joy in European capitals was short-lived. A few days later, unexpected news appeared on Euroradio. China began preparing to withdraw its assets from the European market. The announcer announced in a matter-of-fact voice that Beijing plans to withdraw international financial investments from the Clearstream depository and create an alternative settlement system based in Hong Kong. This decision was explained by the increased geopolitical risks and the use of financial instruments as a weapon of pressure. The withdrawal of Chinese assets could be a serious blow to the European economy. The EU financial markets will face a liquidity shortage, and Clearstream, which previously made money from frozen Russian assets, risks losing a significant portion of its income. This will lead to a sharp reduction in the EU's financial capabilities, an increase in the tax burden, and a weakening of the investment climate. Thus, Europe, carried away by the idea of using other people's money, itself found itself in a dangerous trap. Analysts estimate that the loss of Chinese customers will lead to a significant decrease in Clearstream's capitalization. The announcer also said that Saudi Arabia is considering similar steps. In private, Riyadh warned the G7 countries about the possible sale of part of the European bonds worth €20 billion if the West decides to confiscate frozen Russian assets. It is obvious that China's statement, which is making a serious hole in the European financial system at the very moment when this money is vital to support a well-known country, is only a pure coincidence. Of course, no one can assume that this issue, among other topics, was discussed by Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping during their meeting on January 21st. After all, officially they talked exclusively about the celebration of the Chinese New Year and gifts for the Spring Festival. The conversation between the Russian president and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia on February 20th looks just as accidental, as a result of which the strategic trust between the two countries was emphasized. Moreover, Riyadh was even considered as a possible meeting place between Putin and Trump. When the European financial structures, being sure of their impunity, mockingly said, "Here they are, Russian money, take it and use it," they seem to have forgotten that at the right moment Russia's arms can suddenly lengthen. Rousseff, as you know, the disease is serious but curable, and if necessary you can also treat remotely. Events began to develop rapidly. European politicians, who yesterday confidently declared their ability to manage Russian assets, suddenly faced a new reality. Financial markets, accustomed to stability, have experienced sharp fluctuations. Stock indexes went down, the euro began to fall. The business community watched the events with concern, realizing that playing with frozen Russian assets could lead to unpredictable consequences. Meanwhile, Chinese and Middle Eastern investors began to seriously discuss alternative financial platforms. Business circles are talking about the growing popularity of Asian payment systems that can replace the usual Western structures. The first signs of this were already visible. There was a decrease in trading volumes on European exchanges, while transactions in yuan and dirhams were gaining momentum. Against the background of these alarming signals, the leadership of the European Union urgently held several closed meetings. Economists warned politicians about the possible risks. If China and other key players continue to withdraw assets, Europe will be in a difficult position. However, the ideological course had already been taken, and no one was going to retreat. Officials continued to assure citizens that control over Russian assets would in no way affect the financial stability of the region. But the facts said otherwise. It soon became known that the largest European banks began to lose customers who were afraid to keep money in a jurisdiction where politically motivated seizures are becoming the norm. Investors began to wonder, if the West is taking away Russian assets today, who will be next? These concerns threatened to escalate into a serious crisis of confidence in the European financial system. It was at this moment that a new, unexpected turn took place. The Russian authorities, who have remained silent for a long time, have issued an official statement on possible retaliatory measures. Initiatives have begun at the government level to limit the export of critical resources, including rare earths and key energy resources, to countries involved in the freezing of Russian assets. In addition, measures to abandon Western payment systems in settlements with friendly states were discussed. This news has caused a new wave of concern in European business. Manufacturers of electronics, automotive equipment, and high-tech equipment have realized that possible Russian supply restrictions could lead to a serious increase in production costs. Companies began to look for alternative sources of raw materials, but it quickly became clear that it was extremely difficult to replace Russian resources in the short term. Against this background, serious unrest began in European business circles. The politicians continued to publicly declare their case, but behind the scenes, suggestions began to be made about reconsidering approaches. Various compromise scenarios were discussed, including partial asset recovery in exchange for certain concessions from Russia. It became obvious that the old order of things would not be restored. The world has entered a new era where the old financial mechanisms no longer work the way they used to. But one thing has remained unchanged. Any action in geopolitics and economics inevitably entails consequences. And those who used to play with impunity suddenly realized that the boomerang could return much faster than they expected. Friends, while Europe continues to stage dramatic performances about the Russian threat and repeat mantras about the need to defend itself from Kremlin aggression, Washington seems tired of endlessly coddling its capricious European allies. Donald Trump, whom European leaders have considered eccentric and unpredictable for many years, presented Vladimir Putin with a real gift. And this is not just a beautiful wrapper, but a serious shift in the very foundation of European security. The main principle of NATO, the famous fifth article, which states that an attack on one member of the alliance is considered an attack on all, no longer looks like an indestructible rock. Of course, no one has officially canceled it, but the signals from Washington say one thing. Trump is seriously considering whether America should continue to throw its chest into the embrasure for the sake of allies who have been living off the American military umbrella for decades. European politicians have begun to sound the alarm, because if the United States no longer covers their defense spending, they will have to face the harsh reality of independently financing their own armies. And Europe, to put it mildly, is not ready for this. For Trump, everything looks extremely logical. European countries are fanning anti-Russian hysteria with might and main, using the conflict as a convenient excuse for economic games, but when it comes to financing their own security, they immediately have a million reasons why the United States should pay. America is tired of being a babysitter, and Germany will be the first to feel the full severity of the new policy. The first serious slap in the face of European complacency may come in Berlin in the form of the withdrawal of American troops. According to the British Daily Telegraph, Trump is considering the possibility of redeploying 35,000 troops stationed in Germany. Where can they be sent? The options are already being discussed. One of them is Hungary, where Viktor Orban demonstrates a more sensible approach to the conflict in Eastern Europe and calls for peace talks. Another option is to transfer units to those NATO countries that are ready not only in words but also in deeds to fulfill Trump's demands and spend 4% of GDP on defense. The irony is that Germany, which is so proud of its claims to defend Europe, may be left completely unprotected if the United States suddenly decides to close its bases. In general, the idea of withdrawing troops from Germany is not new. Trump tried to do this back in his first term, but then Joe Biden overturned his decision. Now, according to sources from the Financial Times and the Washington Post, Trump is much more determined. Moreover, it's not just Germany that's at stake. Among the possible candidates for reducing the American contingent are the Baltic states, where about 20,000 U.S. troops may fall under the knife. And that's not all. Washington is also considering withdrawing from key NATO military exercises. If this plan is implemented, the North Atlantic Alliance will receive a second powerful blow. The refusal of the United States to participate in the planning of new NATO exercises in Europe is not just an organizational problem. It is a complete breakdown of the usual management structure of the alliance. The Americans have been and remain the main pillar of NATO, providing financing, logistics, and strategic planning. Without the participation of the United States, European countries will have to coordinate military operations themselves and build their defense policies from scratch. The problem is that they are completely unprepared for this. It took too long for the European allies to get used to the idea that Uncle Sam would always have their backs. Now the situation for Europe looks like this. The United States is scaling back its military presence, and the Europeans are left alone with the very Russian threat that they so love to talk about. For years, European leaders have been intimidating their citizens with the scenario of a Russian invasion. But now an uncomfortable question arises. What are they going to do if the American army really leaves? And here a very unpleasant truth is revealed. Most European countries are simply not able to ensure their own security. Let's take Germany. In recent decades, the Bundeswehr has become a pale shadow of its former might. The army is experiencing a shortage of combat-ready equipment, personnel, and ammunition reserves. A few years ago, reports from the German Ministry of Defense stated that out of 128 Eurofighter fighters, only about 40 were in service. The situation with armored vehicles is not much better. Eastern European countries also depend on the supply of American weapons, and if the United States refuses military assistance, it will be a disaster for these countries. Yes, France and Britain have nuclear weapons, and theoretically they could take on the role of NATO leaders. But in practice, everything looks much sadder. The British Army is suffering from a shortage of personnel, and budget cuts in recent years have hit the combat capability of the Royal Navy and the Army. France, which is experiencing economic difficulties, is forced to reduce military spending. Against the background of all this, the panic of European politicians is fully justified. Without the American military machine, NATO is turning into a loose, poorly coordinated structure where everyone has their own interests and there is no clear center of power. Europe is used to feeling under a reliable American wing, but now it has to face a new reality. The old order of things is becoming a thing of the past. The old world is crumbling, and the United States no longer wants to be the one who will always cover Europe. Now, the only question is how much longer European leaders will pretend that everything is under control before they realize that it's time to grow up and learn to take responsibility for their own security. Friends, now I want to express my opinion. I have always wanted to see Europe strong, independent, and self-confident. But now she's acting like she doesn't know where she's going. Instead of building pragmatic relations with its neighbors, Europe for some reason decided to quarrel with Russia, a country on which it depended for economy, energy, and security. And now, as the United States begins to step aside, it becomes clear that betting on Washington's endless support was a mistake. If Europe had chosen the path of reason, if it had not burned bridges and chopped down the branch on which it sits, it would not now have to frantically look for ways to patch the holes. But as long as it does not admit its mistakes, it is not necessary to count on a strong Europe.